The letters always arrived on Tuesdays, tucked into the rust-pocked mailbox at the end of Elias Vance's gravel driveway. They were clinical, sterile things, printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock, bearing the embossed logo of the Aspen Creek Homeowners Association, a stylized mountain peak cradling a perfectly symmetrical pine tree. The logo was a lie. There were no mountains here, only rolling hills that had been bulldozed into submission. And the pines were imported saplings, staked and wired into rigid uniformity. Elias, a man of 68, with knuckles thickened by a life of work and eyes that held the quiet patience of a geologist, would read them on his porch. His cottage, built of fieldstone and weathered cedar, predated the surrounding development by half a century. It was an island of authenticity. In an ocean of beige stucco and manufactured stone veneer, it was also, according to the letters, a problem. His lawn was not manicured. It was a meadow of native grasses. He did not have a 3-car garage. He had a dilapidated barn where he worked on his old pickup truck. But his greatest sin, the one that truly offended the sensibilities of Aspen Creek, was the stream. It was a modest waterway, born from a spring a mile up the valley. For generations, it had meandered lazily across the landscape, cutting a gentle, life-giving path. It flowed through the back of Elias's 10 acres, whispering over smooth stones. Its banks thick with willows and wild irises. His wife Clara had loved that stream. Before she was gone, she would spend entire afternoons painting it, capturing the dance of light on its surface. Her easel still stood in the corner of the living room, a silent monument to a world that was vanishing. The new world, Aspen Creek, saw the stream not as a feature but a flaw. It was aesthetically inconsistent with the community's master plan, and posed a potential erosion risk to the future site of Phase 2. The Tuesday letter he held today was different. The language had shifted from passive-aggressive suggestion to the cold, hard tone of an ultimatum. The board has voted unanimously, pursuant to County Ordinance 117B, to engage the services of Sterling Civil Engineering to reroute the waterway. Work scheduled to commence on October 12th. October 12th, 2 weeks away, Elias folded the letter, the sharp crease he made in the expensive paper, the only outward sign of his anger. He looked past his meadow, up the gentle slope to where the mansions of Aspen Creek loomed. They were monuments to debt and ego, each one a carbon copy of the next, their vast windows staring down at him like a panel of judgmental eyes. He could see Brenda Harrington's place, the largest of them all, its roofline a complex geometry of pointless gables. She was the HOA president, a woman who wielded neighborhood covenants like a scepter. He knew a direct confrontation was what she wanted. It would allow her to perform, to play the role of the reasonable authority figure, dealing with a recalcitrant, old, eccentric. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction, not yet. His first move was to call his contact at the county planning office, a man named Dave who owed him a favor for helping identify a sinkhole that would have swallowed the new elementary school's football field. They can't do that, can they, Dave? Elias asked, his voice calm, betraying none of the cold dread coiling in his stomach. It's a natural waterway. It's on my property line, but it's been there for 1,000 years. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with apology. I'm sorry, Eli. They dotted every I, got a variance from the environmental board, pushed it through planning last month. Their lawyer is one of the best. He argued it's a necessary mitigation for future development. It's all legal on paper. On paper, Elias repeated, the words tasting like ash. But what about the ground it's on? What? Do you mean, Dave? You've seen the old geosurveys. I have. That whole hillside is compacted alluvial clay over a bedrock of shale. It's stable because of the water table, not in spite of it. That stream acts as a natural pressure release valve. It drains the subsurface water and keeps the clay at a consistent moisture level. If you dam it, block it, and force that water somewhere else? He didn't need to finish. It'll be like squeezing a wet sponge, Dave said, understanding dawning in his voice. The water has to go somewhere. The hydrostatic pressure will— Exactly, Elias said grimly. It will shift the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance is going to be the freshly excavated, loosely packed soil they're about to build their new houses on. Have you told them this? They're not interested in a lecture on soil mechanics from the old man. In the shack, they have Sterling Civil Engineering. He said the name as if it were a disease. Eli, be careful, Dave warned. These people have deep pockets and short tempers. The ground has a longer memory than they do, Elias said, and hung up. His next stop was the barn, pinned to a large corkboard amidst topographical maps and faded photographs of rock formations was a large hand-drawn diagram of his property and the surrounding area. It was a work of art, a lifetime of observation rendered in precise, colored pencil. He had mapped every seep, every spring, every subtle shift in the land's contour. With a red pencil, he began to draw a new line, the proposed path of the rerouted stream. The HOA's plan was brutally simple. They would build a dam just before the stream reached his property, then channel the water into a deep, concrete-lined trench that would run parallel to his fence line, a 100-yard gash in the earth, before dumping the water into a municipal drainage culvert on the far side of his land. A culvert, he knew for a fact, was designed to handle storm runoff from a single road, not the constant flow of an ancient stream. He stared at his drawing, the red line a bleeding wound on the map. He wasn't just looking at a diverted stream. He was looking at a loaded gun, and they were pointing it directly at the foundations of their own homes. He decided to make one last attempt at reason. That evening, he walked up the hill. The air in Aspen Creek was different. It smelled of fertilizer and chlorine from the pools. Automatic sprinklers hissed in the twilight, casting rainbows in the security lights. It was a world hermetically sealed from the one he knew. He knocked on Brenda Harrington's oversized mahogany door. She answered it herself, dressed in crisp white linen pants and a silk blouse. Her smile was tight, a polite baring of teeth. "Mr. Vance," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" "Brenda," he said, forcing himself to use her first name. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to warn you as a professional." He had brought a folder. He tried to show her the geological surveys, the water table charts, his own hand-drawn diagrams. He spoke calmly, professionally, stripping all emotion from his voice. He explained the concept of hydrostatic pressure, of soil saturation, of the unique and fragile composition of the very land her house was built on. "You are destabilizing the entire hillside," he concluded, his voice low and urgent. "This isn't about my yard or my feelings. This is about physics. You are creating a problem that you cannot imagine." She didn't even glance at his papers. She crossed her arms, a look of bored impatience on her face. "Mr. Vance, I appreciate your rustic concerns, but we have paid Sterling Engineering, the top firm in the state, a great deal of money to ensure this is done correctly. They have computer models. They have soil density tests. They have laser levels. I think we'll trust their multi-million-dollar technology over your hand-drawn maps." She handed the unopened folder back to him. "The board has made its decision. The work will proceed as scheduled. Now, if you'll excuse me, my husband and I are about to have dinner." She closed the door in his face. The click of the lock was as final as a gunshot. Elias walked back down the hill in the gathering dark, the folder heavy in his hand. He had offered them the truth. He had offered them a warning. They had thrown it back in his face. Very well. He would not offer it again. October 12th arrived with a cold gray sky. The sound came first, the guttural roar of a diesel engine, the percussive clang of a tailgate dropping. Then the machine itself appeared, a massive yellow excavator. Its steel claw stained with the dirt of other violated landscapes. It lumbered to the edge of his property, followed by a crew of men in hard hats and fluorescent vests. Elias stood on his porch, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands. He didn't watch them. He watched the houses on the hill. He watched Brenda Harrington's house, where a woman he assumed was a housekeeper was polishing the already gleaming windows. He watched the Chen house next door, a young tech guy named Mark who had once waved at him but now averted his gaze when he drove by. The work was brutally efficient. The excavator's claw tore into the earth, ripping out the willows and the irises, scooping up the smooth, dark stones that Clara had loved. They were just rubble now, tossed aside. They built the dam, a crude wall of earth and rock, and the stream, which had flowed freely for a millennium, began to pool, confused. Then they dug the trench, a raw, gaping wound along his fence line. It was deep and straight, an offense to the natural curves of the land. Day after day he listened to the sounds of destruction, the whine of saws cutting concrete forms, the rumble of cement trucks, the shouts of the foreman. He spent his time in the barn. He methodically organized his tools. He repaired the engine of his old tractor. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, channeling his rage into methodical tasks. He was preparing. The collective gasp from the partygoers was sharp enough to cut through the driving rain. Champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. Laughter died in throats. All eyes were fixed on the splintering facade of Brenda Harrington's outdoor kitchen. Where the web of cracks was now visibly widening, a chunk of stucco, the size of a dinner plate, broke free and shattered on the flagstones below. Brenda's triumphant smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of horrified disbelief. "It's nothing," she announced, her voice a pitch too high, too brittle. "It's just the house settling. A storm like this, ... But her words were drowned out by a new sound, a low, grinding roar that vibrated up through the soles of their shoes. It was the sound of immense pressure and friction. The grand, terraced retaining walls that separated Brenda's property from the Chen's began to bow outward, the meticulously stacked stones groaning in protest. Water, muddy and brown, began to weep from the seams between them. Panic, cold, and sharp, finally pierced the bubble of Aspen Creek's arrogance. The party dissolved into a chaos of shouted questions and hurried goodbyes. People scrambled for their cars, tires spinning on the suddenly slick, expensive pavers of Brenda's driveway. They weren't just fleeing a rainstorm. They were fleeing a feeling, a terrifying primal sense that the very ground they had bought and tamed was now turning against them. Mark Chen didn't run. He stood frozen by the outdoor fireplace, his tech-addled mind struggling to process the sensory data. The trembling ground, the groaning walls, the memory of the old man, Elias Vance, standing on his porch with a folder full of warnings. "You are destabilizing the entire hillside." The words echoed in his head, no longer the ramblings of a crank, but the chilling accuracy of a prophet. He looked over at Brenda, who was frantically directing her husband, a portly man named Gary, to move the patio furniture under the loggia. "The wicker will be ruined," she shrieked, her focus narrowed to the trivial, a desperate attempt to maintain control in a situation that was spiraling far beyond her comprehension. Mark backed away slowly, then turned and broke into a run. Not toward his car, but toward his own house next door. He burst through his front door, his wife Sarah rushing to meet him. "Mark, what's happening?" The whole house just shook. "Where's Leo?" he gasped, his only thought for their 4-year-old son. "He's asleep upstairs." "Why, get him. Get your purse. And get in the car. We're going to your sister's." "What? Mark, you're scaring me?" He grabbed her by the shoulders, his eyes wide with a fear she had never seen before. "Sarah, please, just do it. The ground it's moving. The walls at Brenda's are cracking apart." He pointed toward their own living room wall, the one that faced the Harringtons' property. A thin diagonal crack had appeared in the plaster, tracing the line of the ceiling. As they watched, a fine powder of dust drifted down from it. The illusion of safety shattered. This wasn't happening to Brenda. It was happening to them. While Aspen Creek descended into chaos, Elias Vance stood calmly on his porch, a sentinel. In the storm, the water in his yard was now knee-deep, a muddy, swirling mess. The rerouted stream was a monster, a furious brown dragon clawing at the earth. He watched the headlights snake away from Brenda's house, a frantic exodus. He felt no satisfaction, no schadenfreude, only a profound and weary sadness. He had told them, he had shown them the maps, he had offered them the science, the truth. Etched into the land itself, their ignorance had been a choice, and the consequences were just beginning. He went inside, dripping water onto the old wooden floors. He pulled out a box from under his bed, a collection of Clara's things. From it, he retrieved her journals. She hadn't just been a painter, she had been a meticulous observer. For 30 years, she had chronicled the life of their small valley, the rainfall, the seasonal changes in the stream's flow, the way the ground felt under her feet. He opened a volume from a decade earlier, April 10th, the 100-year flood. The stream is a torrent, 3 feet above its usual banks. The meadow is completely submerged, but the water drains within hours. The old willows hold the banks firm. The ground on the hill seems to drink it all up, firm and solid. He knew what she knew. The old ecosystem was a perfect machine. The meadow acted as a floodplain, the deep-rooted trees as anchors, the porous soil of the hillside as a massive sponge. Now, the floodplain was gone, the anchors were ripped out, and the sponge was being force-fed through a fire hose the next morning. The rain had softened to a persistent gray drizzle. The full extent of the damage was revealed in the stark light of day. A massive, crescent-shaped slump had occurred on the hillside, centered directly behind Brenda Harrington's property. Her multi-tiered landscaped garden was a wreck of displaced earth and broken retaining walls. The deep end of her infinity pool had cracked, leaking chlorinated water that mingled with the mud. The foundation of her home was now visibly exposed. On one side, a raw concrete wound dangling in the air. It was worse for the Chens. The retaining wall between their properties had failed completely, collapsing in a tidal wave of mud and stone that had slammed into the side of their house. The mud was piled 3 feet high against their sliding glass doors, which had shattered inward, spewing a filthy slurry into their dining room. By 8 a.m., the cul-de-sac was swarming. Not with party guests, but with insurance adjusters, structural engineers, and a bewildered-looking crew from Sterling Civil Engineering. The firm that had promised a state-of-the-art solution. Elias watched them from his porch, sipping his coffee. He saw Brenda Harrington, her face pale and strained, gesturing wildly as she spoke to a man in a crisp suit. He saw Mark Chen, his shoulders slumped in defeat, talking to an insurance adjuster who was shaking his head grimly. Around noon, a convoy arrived, Brenda, Mark, and 2 other HOA board members, marching down his gravel driveway. They're expensive. Shoes were caked in mud. Their expressions were a volatile cocktail of fury, desperation, and fear. Brenda didn't bother with pleasantries. She jabbed a finger, trembling with rage, not at him but at his flooded yard. "This is your fault," she screeched. "Your property isn't draining correctly. The water is backing up from your land and undermining everything." Elias took a slow sip of his coffee. "My property isn't draining correctly," he stated, his voice flat and even, "because the waterway you built is pouring 10 times the volume of water into a culvert designed for 1/10 of the load. The water has nowhere to go. It's basic physics. I believe the term is bottleneck. Don't you get smart with us?" One of the other board members, a man named Todd, snapped, "You did something to cause this? You probably sabotaged the culvert." Elias almost laughed. "I sabotaged it. I didn't need to. You did it for me when you signed the contract. You overloaded the system." It was Mark Chen who spoke next, his voice quiet and heavy with resignation. "He warned us," he said, not looking at Elias, but at Brenda. "He came to your house. He tried to show us the maps. He told us this would happen." Brenda whirled on him. "Are you siding with him? After what this has done to your home? What this has done?" Mark's voice cracked with emotion. "What we did, Brenda. We were arrogant. We didn't listen." He finally looked at Elias, his eyes pleading. "Is there any way to fix it? To stop it from getting worse?" Elias set his mug down on the porch railing. He looked at their desperate faces. They weren't neighbors seeking advice. They were a lynch mob looking for a scapegoat, now grasping for a savior because their first plan had backfired. "Fix it," he said, his voice taking on the hard edge of a geologist describing an irreversible event. "The hydrostatic pressure has been fundamentally altered. The alluvial clay has been hypersaturated. It has lost its cohesion. You've created a slow-motion landslide. You can't fix that. You can only get out of its way." He let the words hang in the damp air. "What does that mean?" Brenda asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It means that crack in your foundation is a symptom, not the problem. The problem is that the earth your house is sitting on is beginning to flow downhill, and it wants to take your house with it." He pointed to a series of smaller cracks and fissures that had appeared all over the hillside, like stretch marks on skin being pulled too tight, and it's not going to stop. The board members stared at him, their faces a canvas of dawning horror. They had wanted to move a stream. They had instead awakened something ancient and inexorable. "No," Brenda stammered, shaking her head in denial. "The engineers, Sterling, they can drill piers, build a bigger wall. They can shore it up. You can try," Elias said with a shrug. "You can spend millions of dollars fighting gravity, or you can accept that you built your castles on a foundation of sand, or in this case, wet clay." He turned and walked back into his cottage, closing the door behind him, leaving them standing in his muddy driveway to contemplate the ruin they had wrought. The days that followed were a surreal spectacle. Aspen Creek transformed into a full-blown construction zone. Massive drilling rigs were brought in, their engines a constant throbbing roar. Sterling Engineering, now in full panic mode to avoid a catastrophic lawsuit, began a desperate attempt to stabilize the substrator. They drilled deep into the hillside, intending to pour concrete piers down to the bedrock to pin the sliding layer of clay in place. The click of the light switch inside the Harrington house echoed in the cavernous silence of the night like a hammer cocking. Elias froze, his flashlight beam fixed on the distorted gas pipe. The shimmering haze around the fitting was no longer a trick of the light. It was a visible, undulating plume of methane. Every horror story he'd ever heard about natural gas explosions, the silent, odorless killer, the single spark, the instantaneous, obliterating fireball rushed through his mind. He was 50 yards away, too far to shout without being mistaken. For a prowler, too close for comfort. His mind, trained to think in geological time, was now forced into a frantic, split-second calculation of risk. The house light could be anything: a lamp on a timer, a security feature. But what if it was Brenda or Gary awake and moving through their tilting, groaning home? What if one of them decided to make coffee? The click of a stove igniter would be the last sound anyone on this hillside ever heard. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, surged through him. He snapped off his flashlight and scrambled back from the trench, his boots slipping in the slick mud. He had to warn them. He had to get them out. All the anger, the resentment, the bitter satisfaction he might have felt evaporated in the face of imminent, fiery death. He didn't care about their arrogance anymore. He only cared that the people inside that house were breathing on borrowed time. He half ran, half stumbled across the ruined landscape toward the front of the house, his path illuminated by the cold, indifferent glow of security lights. He pounded on the massive mahogany door, his fists making a desperate, hollow sound. "Brenda, Gary, get out of the house. There's a gas leak," he yelled, his voice raw against the damp night air. "Brenda, can you hear me? The gas main is broken." A light came on in an upstairs window. A moment later, a voice, muffled by the thick door and insulated walls, called out, "Who's there? Go away or I'm calling the police." It was Brenda. "It's Elias Vance. For God's sake, Brenda, listen to me. Your house is about to explode." The upstairs window slid open. Brenda Harrington's face, framed in the opening, was a mask of fury. What are you doing on my property? This is harassment. I'm calling 911 right now." "Fine, call them." Elias shouted back, desperation making him frantic. "Tell them to send the fire department. The main gas line at the back of your house has sheared off. The whole area is filled with gas." He could see the conflict in her eyes, the ingrained dismissal. Of him as a nuisance warring with the primal fear his words ignited. "You're lying," she spat, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're just trying to scare us. Go to the back of your house. Look at the meter," he pleaded. "But don't turn on any lights. Don't use your phone. Just get out." Suddenly, a deeper, more violent tremor shook the ground. It was not the slow, grinding slide of the past few weeks. This was a lurch. A sickening vertical drop of several inches that was accompanied by a terrifying symphony of destruction from within the house. The sharp crack of snapping timber, the crystalline shatter of glass, and a prolonged metallic groan as the home's steel skeleton twisted in agony. Brenda screamed, staggering back from the window. Inside the house, her husband Gary bellowed in confusion and fear. Elias backed away from the porch, his eyes wide with horror, watching as a new, massive crack zippered up the front wall of the house right below the window where Brenda had been standing. The front steps buckled, the portico over the door slumping visibly to one side. The house wasn't just sinking anymore, it was breaking apart. The solution cavity below, gorged with pressurized water, was collapsing. He didn't have to yell anymore. The house was screaming for him. He fumbled for his own phone, his fingers clumsy with cold and adrenaline. He dialed 911. "My name is Elias Vance," he said, his voice tight and controlled. Falling back on the calm professionalism of a man used to describing disasters, "I'm at Aspen Creek. There is an active catastrophic structural failure at the Harrington residence, 1120 Summit View Lane. The house is collapsing into a sinkhole. There is also a major natural gas leak from a broken main. You need to dispatch fire and emergency services immediately, and you need to tell them to kill the power and gas to this entire grid." Now, he didn't wait for a response. He knew the clock was ticking. He looked back at the house. The front door burst open and Gary Harrington stumbled out. A portly man in silk pajamas, his face ashen. "The floor. It's caving in," he stammered, pointing back into the dark maw of his home. "Where's Brenda?" Elias demanded. She fell in the master bedroom. The floor gave way. His eyes were wide with shock, uncomprehending. Before Elias could react, a section of the roof above the master bedroom on the corner of the house, cantilevered over the sinkhole, began to collapse inward. Tiles slid off, crashing into the darkness below, followed by the sound of splintering rafters. Elias grabbed Gary by the arm, pulling him farther from the house. "We have to get her." It was an insane thought. The house was a death trap, groaning and shifting like a dying beast, saturated with explosive gas, but the image of the woman, any person trapped inside, was more than he could bear. He saw the Sterling Engineering trailer parked down the street, its generator humming. He sprinted toward it, Gary stumbling behind him. He kicked the flimsy door open. Inside, blueprints were scattered across a table. Pathetic, useless plans. He ignored them. He was looking for tools. He found what he needed: 2 heavy-duty flashlights, explosion-proof models, designed for inspecting confined spaces, and a crowbar. He shoved one flashlight and the crowbar into Gary's hands. "You know the layout. Get me to the master bedroom. Stay low and don't make a spark." The two men, a pair of sworn enemies united by terror, ran back toward the collapsing house. The air was thick with the sickly sweet stench of gas. It was no longer a faint odor. It was a suffocating presence. They entered through the ruined front doorway, stepping over the buckled threshold into a nightmare. The grand 2-story foyer was unrecognizable. The marble floor was shattered, tilted at a steep angle leading down into a newly opened chasm in the center of the house. The massive chandelier had crashed to the floor, a tangled wreck of crystal and brass. "The main staircase is gone," Gary whispered, his voice trembling. "We have to use the back stairs." They navigated the treacherous sloping floor, their flashlight beams cutting through the dust-filled darkness. Every step was a gamble. The house groaned around them, a constant, terrifying chorus of a structure tearing itself apart. They could hear water, not the sound of rain, but the gurgle and rush of the underground cavern that had breached the foundations. They reached the back of the house, where a service staircase, its frame bolted directly to what was, for now, a more stable wall, was still intact. Up there, Gary said, pointing. They took the stairs 2 at a time. The air grew thicker with gas the higher they went. On the second-floor landing, the damage was even more profound. The hallway floor sloped violently downward, toward the front of the house. The master bedroom is at the end of the hall, Gary choked out, pointing. The door was jammed shut, the frame twisted. Elias wedged the crowbar in the gap. "Help me," he grunted. Together, they threw their weight against it. The wood splintered, the lock gave way, and the door flew open. The sight before them was apocalyptic. A huge section of the bedroom floor had collapsed entirely, creating a jagged hole that opened into the darkness of the ruined living room below. On the far side of the chasm, on a tilting slab of floor that was still attached to the exterior wall, lay Brenda. She was conscious, a thin whimper escaping her lips. Her leg was twisted at an unnatural angle beneath a fallen antique dresser. "Brenda," Gary cried out, starting forward. "Stay back," Elias commanded, grabbing his arm. That whole section could go at any second. He scanned the room, his geologist's eyes assessing the structure, not as a room, but as a rock face about to give way. The remaining floor was a cantilever, a shelf of wood and nails holding on by sheer luck. But luck was running out. "The dresser is pinning her," Elias said, his mind working furiously. "If we can move it, she might be able to crawl back." There was a heavy, ornate bed frame a few feet from the edge of the collapse. It was solid oak. It was their only chance for an anchor. He saw a set of expensive-looking curtains, thick and velvet. "The drapes," he said to Gary. "Tear them down. Tie them together. Make a rope." While Gary, spurred by a desperate hope, ripped the heavy fabric from its mountings, Elias crawled on his belly to the edge of the chasm. "Brenda," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Brenda, can you hear me? We're going to get you out." She looked at him, her eyes wide with pain and terror. The arrogant HOA president was gone, stripped away by the raw physics of the disaster she had set in motion. In her place was just a terrified woman. "My leg," she whispered. "It's broken. I know we're going to move the dresser. When we do, you have to pull yourself back. Can you do that?" She nodded weakly, tears streaming through the dust on her face. Gary had fashioned a makeshift rope from the curtains. Elias took one end, braced his feet against the solid bed frame, and tossed the other end across the gap to Brenda. "Tie this around your wrist, the one on your good arm." With trembling fingers, she did as she was told. "Okay, Gary," Elias said, handing him the crowbar. "I'm going to brace her with the rope. You have to get over there and live." The fire burned all night, a raging golden pyre against the black sky. It devoured what the sinkhole had not, consuming the hubris of Aspen Creek room by room. Fire crews, hampered by the unstable ground and the ruptured water mains, could do little more than contain the blaze, dousing the neighboring shell-shocked homes to prevent the inferno from spreading. The Harrington mansion did not burn to the ground. It burned into the ground, collapsing into the ever-widening maw of the sinkhole until all that remained was a smoldering, debris-choked crater. By dawn, a new kind of storm had descended on Aspen Creek. The rain had ceased, but the neighborhood was now deluged by a flood of official vehicles. The state fire marshal, the county sheriff, the Public Utility Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, even a quiet, serious-looking man from the State Geological Survey, they were all there. The cul-de-sac was a sea of flashing lights and yellow tape, a quarantine zone of catastrophic failure. Elias Vance sat on his porch, a thick blanket draped over his shoulders by a paramedic. He had refused to go to the hospital. He watched the swarm of officials with the weary detachment of a man who had seen the inevitable finally arrive. He was no longer a pariah. He was a witness. He had given his statement 3 times, each time, with the same dispassionate clarity, describing the rerouted stream, the saturated clay, the solution cavity, the gas leak. He laid out the chain of causality with the precision of a scientist, letting the facts speak for themselves. His words, once dismissed as the ramblings of a crank, were now the foundation of a multi-agency investigation. The man from the Geological Survey, a geologist named Dr. Eris Thorne with tired eyes and muddy boots, sought him out specifically. He had a copy of the original geosurvey Elias had tried to show Brenda. "Mr. Vance," Thorne said, skipping the pleasantries, "your warnings were prescient. We're looking at your hand-drawn maps now. They're more accurate than the initial surveys Sterling Engineering submitted for their permit." He gestured toward the smoldering crater. They didn't just ignore you, they ignored basic geological prudence. They saw that solution cavity on the preliminary dig and logged it as a void filled with compacted debris. They didn't investigate, they just paved over it. They were in a hurry, Elias said, his voice raspy. Building castles takes time. Building McMansions just takes leverage. Thorne nodded grimly. Well, their leverage just ran out. He pulled a tablet from his bag, showing Elias a thermal imaging map of the hillside taken from a drone. It was a terrifying patchwork of colors. Cold blue spots indicated areas of extreme water saturation. A large, angry red bloom showed the residual heat from the fire, but most alarmingly, there were other fainter blue splotches, pockets of underground water scattered all over the hill, clustered beneath the foundations of other houses. The Harrington property was ground zero, Thorne explained, but the entire slope is compromised. We're recommending the immediate and mandatory evacuation of the 4 adjacent properties. The rest of the development is on notice. Until we can determine the extent of the substrata instability, this entire place is a geological red zone. The words mandatory evacuation spread through the neighborhood faster than the fire had. Panic gave way to a cold, hard fury. Residents who had once nodded politely to Brenda Harrington at the mailbox now stood on their perfect lawns, watching as sheriff's deputies methodically went door to door, slapping large red unsafe for habitation placards on the homes of their neighbors. Mark Chen's house was one of them. He and Sarah stood with their son Leo, watching movers hired at exorbitant emergency rates, hastily packing their lives into boxes. Their dream home, the culmination of a decade of savings and work, was now just another piece of evidence. In a disaster zone, the mud still stained their dining room walls, a permanent reminder of the initial breach. Now, the threat was silent, invisible. Lurking in the very ground beneath them, Mark found Elias by the yellow tape, his face a mixture of shame and desperation. "They're condemning our house," he said, his voice hollow. "The insurance company called. They're denying the claim. They're citing a willful negligence clause and pointing to the HOA's decision to reroute the stream against expert advice." "My advice," Elias clarified, his tone devoid of triumph. "Yes," Mark admitted, finally looking him in the eye. "Your advice. I stood in Brenda's living room and voted yes on the proposal. She called you a litigious old man standing in the way of progress, and I believed her. We all did." He ran a hand through his hair, his composure crumbling. "We're ruined. Mr. Vance, everything we have is tied up in that house. We can't sell it. We can't live in it. But the bank still wants its mortgage payment." He was not just talking about himself. He was the voice of Aspen Creek. The story was the same for everyone. The million-dollar homes were worthless, toxic assets. The HOA, which was legally the collective of homeowners, was now facing a mountain of liability that dwarfed their annual budget for petunias and holiday decorations. The media had arrived. In force, their news vans forming a secondary blockade at the entrance to the development. The story was too perfect to ignore. Wealthy suburbanites in their palatial homes, undone by their own arrogance, a modern-day fable of karma. Elias, the reclusive Cassandra, became the reluctant star. They ambushed him on his porch, shoving microphones in his face. "Mr. Vance, is it true you warned the HOA this would happen? How does it feel to be proven so catastrophically right? Do you blame your neighbors for what happened?" He answered them all with the same maddening calm. "I presented the facts. The land did the rest. This isn't about blame, it's about cause and effect. Water always wins." His quiet dignity was more damning than any accusation he could have leveled. He wasn't a victim seeking revenge. He was a scientist stating a conclusion, and it made for infuriatingly compelling television. Brenda Harrington became the villain. Photographed on a stretcher, her face smudged with soot, her leg in a temporary splint, she became the poster child for hubris. She and Gary were taken to the hospital, but their legal troubles began before their medical treatment did. The district attorney's office, smelling a high-profile criminal negligence case, had already posted a detective outside her hospital room. Released 2 days later, with her leg in a heavy cast and her spirit shattered, she was served with a stack of legal papers, so thick it looked like a phone book. Lawsuits from the Chen family and the other evacuated homeowners, a gross negligence suit from her own insurance company, and a notice from the DA that she, along with the other board members, was the subject of a criminal investigation into reckless endangerment. She and Gary were forced to move into a sterile, extended-stay hotel near the interstate. Their assets frozen, their friends suddenly scarce. The pedestal of social superiority from which she had ruled Aspen Creek had been obliterated. One afternoon, driven by a morbid need to see, she had Gary drive her to the edge of the police line. She stared at the yellow tape, the uniformed officers, the blackened crater that had been her home. All that she had worked for, schemed for, and lorded over others was gone. She saw Elias Vance, standing on his porch, talking to the geologist Thorne. They were looking at maps, pointing up at the hillside. They weren't angry or celebratory. They were just two professionals studying a problem. And in that moment, Brenda understood. To Elias, it had never been a personal fight. It was a matter of principle, of fact. She was the one who had made it personal. She had dismissed his knowledge, insulted his home, and weaponized the stream his wife had loved. And in doing so, she had authored her own destruction. The investigation moved quickly. The void that Sterling Engineering had filled with concrete was confirmed to be the main drainage point for the entire valley's subsurface water. By the surface stream, they had increased the hydraulic pressure. By plugging the underground drain, they had sealed the system. They had created, as Dr. Thorne put it in his preliminary report, a perfect storm of geological instability. Sterling's lawyers went into damage control. They tried to shift the blame, claiming the HOA had provided them with faulty historical data and had insisted on the most cost-effective rerouting plan. But the paper trail was damning. An internal Sterling email subpoenaed by the DA revealed one of their junior engineers had raised concerns identical to Elias's. His warning was dismissed by a senior partner with a note scribbled in the margin. Client Harrington is adamant. Proceed as planned. Liability is with the HOA if substrata issues arise. That email was the nail in the coffin. It demonstrated foreknowledge. It was the linchpin for criminal charges. The news broke, and the remaining residents of Aspen Creek turned on their former leader with a vengeance. The HOA held an emergency meeting in the community clubhouse, the one building on the grounds still deemed structurally sound. It was a vicious, chaotic affair. Brenda, against her lawyer's advice, decided to attend. She hobbled in on crutches, her face pale, her eyes hollow. The room fell silent, the air thick with hatred. Todd, the board member who had accused Elias of sabotage, was the first to speak. "This is all your fault, Brenda," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "You pushed this. You told us he was a nobody. My house is worthless. I'm going to lose everything because of..." The weight of the manila envelope in Elias Vance's hands was heavier than any stone. It was the full, unvarnished truth, a testament to a greed so profound it was willing to poison an entire ecosystem for profit. The destruction of Aspen Creek, the ruin of dozens of families, the explosion that had nearly killed him, it had all been collateral damage in a much larger, more sinister plot. The rerouted stream wasn't a blunder. It was a weapon. It had simply misfired for a day. Elias did nothing. He sat with the documents spread across his large oak table, cross-referencing Brenda's conspiratorial memos with Sterling's doctored engineering reports and Clara's decades-old journals. It was all there, a perfect, horrifying mosaic of intent. He felt a rage colder and deeper than any he had experienced before. It was the rage of a steward watching a desecration. He thought about his options. He could give the envelope to the district attorney. The evidence was a prosecutor's dream, a slam-dunk case for conspiracy, fraud, and a dozen environmental felonies. Brenda Harrington and her brother-in-law would go to prison for years. The senior partners at Sterling Engineering would be disbarred and disgraced. Justice, in the legal sense, would be served. But as he looked out his window at the scarred hillside, at the yellow tape fluttering like prayer flags for the dead, he knew that legal justice felt hollow. It was a human system, designed to punish human crimes. What had been committed here was a crime against the land itself, and the land deserved its own form of restitution. The next morning, he did not go to the DA. He went to Dr. Eris Thorne. He found the geologist at the edge of the evacuation zone, taking soil core samples. Elias laid the key documents on the hood of Thorne's muddy pickup truck. As Thorne read, his professional calm dissolved, replaced by a look of astonishment, then outrage. "They were going to kill the wetlands," Thorne said, his voice a low growl, deliberately. "Do you know what would have happened if they'd succeeded? The reservoir effect of that marshland prevents this entire valley from flooding during spring thaws. They wouldn't have just built a new subdivision. They would have put every home downstream all the way to the old town at risk." "I know," Elias said simply. "This changes everything," Thorne said, looking up from the papers. "This isn't just negligence. This is a potential Class A environmental crime. This goes beyond the state. The EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers need to see this. This is federal." "I know," Elias repeated. "But before you make that call, I have a proposal. It's not about punishment. It's about restoration." For the next hour, Elias laid out his plan. It was audacious, unconventional, and rooted not in legal precedent, but in ecological reality. Thorne listened intently, a slow smile eventually spreading across his face. "It's brilliant," the geologist said when Elias finished. "I think I know a federal judge who might just have the vision to see it through." The news of the conspiracy broke 2 weeks later. It wasn't leaked to the media but revealed in a stunning legal filing. The state of Arizona, joined by the Environmental Protection Agency, filed a massive civil and criminal lawsuit against the Aspen Creek HOA, Sterling Engineering, and Brenda Harrington's Shell Corporation. But it was the nature of the proposed settlement that sent shockwaves through the legal community. The plaintiffs were not seeking merely financial damages or prison sentences. They were invoking an obscure provision of environmental law dealing with reparative justice. They argued that since the defendants' assets, the land and properties of Aspen Creek itself, were acquired and developed as part of a criminal conspiracy to destroy a protected ecosystem, those assets were forfeit. The goal was not to punish the perpetrators with fines they could eventually pay, but to use their ill-gotten gains to heal the wound they had inflicted. The legal battle was titanic but brief. Faced with incontrovertible evidence of fraud and conspiracy, the defense crumbled. Sterling Engineering, to avoid having its corporate charter permanently revoked, turned state's evidence, offering up every scrap of data they had. The other HOA board members, facing financial ruin and potential jail time, quickly followed suit, leaving Brenda and her brother-in-law to twist in the wind. The final hearing was held in a federal courtroom. Brenda Harrington, looking frail and defeated in a cheap pantsuit, sat next to her public defender. Mark Chen and the other homeowners filled the back of the courtroom, their faces grim. They were no longer wealthy suburbanites. They were refugees of a disaster, hoping for any scrap of restitution. Elias Vance sat in the front row, next to Dr. Thorne. He was not there as a victim, but as a technical advisor to the court. The judge, a formidable woman with a reputation for creative sentencing, delivered her verdict without ceremony. This court finds that the Aspen Creek development, from its inception, the rerouting of the stream, the subsequent landslide and explosion, and the financial ruin of its residents are all direct consequences of this conspiracy. She turned her gaze on Brenda. "Your client, Ms. Harrington, sought to sacrifice a vital natural resource for personal enrichment. The irony is that in doing so, she has sacrificed everything she owned." The sentence was devastating. Brenda and her brother-in-law were found guilty on all criminal counts, receiving the maximum sentences allowed. Sterling Engineering was fined into bankruptcy, its assets seized, but it was the civil judgment that delivered the final poetic blow. "The court hereby dissolves the Aspen Creek Homeowners Association," the judge declared. "All property titles within the development are declared null and void, as they were based on a fraudulent master plan. The entire 500-acre parcel of land known as Aspen Creek is to be seized and placed into federally managed environmental trust." A wave of shock and anger rolled through the homeowners in the gallery. They had lost their homes, and now they were losing the very land beneath them. The judge held up a hand for silence. "This court is not blind to the plight of the homeowners," she continued. "They were victims of this scheme as well. Therefore, any funds recovered from the liquidation of the defendant's other assets will be placed in a restitution fund for the mortgage holders. It will not make you whole," she said, looking directly at Mark Chen, "but it is the best that can be done." Then came the final extraordinary part of the ruling. The trust's sole mandate, the judge announced, will be the complete and total restoration of the Aspen Creek hillside and the surrounding valley to its natural state. The primary contract for this restoration will be awarded to a newly formed nonprofit, the Clara Vance Ecological Trust. Elias felt a jolt, as if struck by lightning. He had not known this was coming. The judge continued, a slight smile playing on her lips. "The director of this trust will be Dr. Eris Thorne. Its chief advisor overseeing all practical work will be Mr. Elias Vance. Their first order of business will be the demolition and removal of every remaining structure in Aspen Creek. Their second will be the undamming of the stream, returning it to its original natural course." The gavel fell. It was over. The aftermath was a slow, deliberate unwinding. The remaining houses of Aspen Creek, once symbols of status, were dismantled, piece by piece. Their manufactured stone and stucco hauled away like the refuse it was. The roads were torn up, the curbs and sidewalks pulverized into gravel. Elias, now vested with the authority he had always possessed and knowledge, oversaw it all. He worked with Thorne and a team of conservationists, using his old maps and Clara's journals as their guide. They did not just demolish, they deconstructed. And then came the day he had been waiting for. He stood with the work crew beside the concrete dam that had started it all. He, not a stranger in a hard hat, was the one who gave the signal. A massive hydraulic hammer struck the concrete wall. It cracked, then shattered. With a deep, resonant sigh, The water of the stream, held captive for so long, surged forward. It did not rush violently. It flowed. It hesitated for a moment, then found the ghost of its old path, the gentle, meandering course it had followed for 1,000 years. It washed over the smooth, dark stones that had been buried for months. It whispered through the willow saplings. They had just planted it, flowed past the spot where his cottage stood. A gentle, life-giving murmur. The sound of Clara's paintings. In the years that followed, the land began to heal. Native grasses returned to the hillsides. The ugly gash of the rerouted channel was filled in and reseeded. The smoldering crater where Brenda's house had stood became a vernal pool teeming with frogs and dragonflies. The land, freed from its burden, was breathing again. Elias never rebuilt his fence. His 10 acres and the 500 acres of the former Aspen Creek were now one contiguous sanctuary. He would walk the recovering hills, often with Mark Chen, who had taken a low-paying job with the Conservation Trust, finding a purpose he'd never known in his tech career. They rarely spoke of the past. They spoke of soil composition and erosion. Control. One crisp autumn afternoon, Elias stood on the highest point of the hill. He looked down at the valley, a panorama of recovering green. The stream glittered below, a silver ribbon, stitching the land back together. He thought of the title they had given him, the Old Man and the Cottage.